For today's critical thought, we are talking about more of the advanced nuances when it comes to action design, and what makes good combat pop compared to more on the repetitive side, and just how many S's you can put before the word stylish when you're designing your own combat system. We're going to go straight to the footage for our video today because, like with platforming, it's very hard to convey through screenshots and just kind of words or text what makes advanced combat go so well and what makes it different from kind of lesser examples. When we talk about how much combat has changed and grown, from indie to AAA, 2D to 3D, and so on and so forth, a lot of the best games give the player the freedom to kind of experiment and improvise their own way through. You can still have fixed combos, special moves, stuff like that. But the more ways that the player can fight, and the more ways that you are allowed to fight, that's a very important distinction, is what separates a lot of action design from one another. It's again very similar to that of the platformer genre, that everyone can make a jump, but making a jump that feels good is a very different story. It's what separates, again, Mario from any other 2D or 3D platformer. Now, when it comes to combat, one of the biggest things that we see is this idea of compartmentalizing the enemy designs. This is a way that, instead of the player having to think about or kind of devise a plan, it's all spelled right out in front of them. And we see this a lot in AAA action titles. How many of you have played a game where it goes like this? The thin enemy can be hit by anything. Armor enemies can only be hurt by heavy attacks. The ninja enemy can only be grabbed. The breakdancing enemy you must dodge and then do a counter. And the idea here is that it's supposed to allow the player to rapid fire process a fight. Okay, we have 3 heavies, 2 ninjas. I know what to do. 2 heavies, 1 breakdancer, and so on. But this ends up making combat feel very mechanical and very repetitive, because that 1 heavy enemy, if you try any other strategy, it doesn't work. And this is where we see kind of like the first breakdown in a lot of action design. When no matter how many enemies you have, how many moves, dodges, parries, whatever, combat gets degraded into just repeating the same thing. Here's another example that I'm sure if you have seen in 3D action Souls-like titles. When your basic attack doesn't have a hit stun, but your heavy or the very slow wind-up attack does. So what ends up happening is that the best strategy is to just always lead with that heavy, because you know if you connect with it, it will hit some of the enemy, which will set them for more attacks. The other example, of course, is when there is no hit stun no matter what, and then combat will just always degrade into dodge around, do a few hits, dodge back around, do a few more hits, rinse and repeat until the enemy dies. And it can lead to this being very boring. What you're trying to achieve with advanced combat is that it needs to feel like the player has a variety of ways of fighting, beyond just a game just putting up a giant coat of yellow paint and saying, shoot right here, shoot right here. And when I first was thinking about this topic, I was playing Doom the Dark Ages and specifically the DLC and thinking about how it compares and contrasts to Doom Eternal. And what we see from games that are trying to make their combat systems more engaging and more involved is the idea of either implicitly or explicitly wanting the player to experiment. So, implicit examples are any games that have scores, ranks, being able to reward the player, show off how great your mastery is of combat. The Devil May Cry's, Bayonetta's. Again, pick any action game that grades the player. Maybe there's a reward of score, souls, more music. The explicit example is when, going back to our previous point with having these specific enemy types, where if this enemy can only be hurt using rockets, then you're going to use rockets on that. And if this one can only be hit with lightning, you get the picture. And To bring this back to Doom, Dark Ages, and Eternal, you can see how implicit and explicit can really work between those two. Doom Eternal is very much an example of explicitly forcing the player to make use of its combat. The whole hit point system, weapons doing different kinds of damage, hitting specific parts. With the Dark Ages, they removed a lot of that. The most kind of complex or nuance you have is using the plasma gun or plasma energy to kind of electrify or charge an enemy to do more damage to them. But because of the slower weapon swapping and just the kind of raw damage you're doing, it's oftentimes, at least in the lower difficulties, not really necessary. You can also compare this to the likes of Ultra Kill. Ultra Kill is a very technical game. There is a lot of nuance you have between the different weapons, how they interact with one another, the different combos that go with it. None of that is really required to beat the game. If you're not good at the coin flipping, there's never going to be a boss or an enemy in Ultra Kill that can only be hurt through coin flips, or can only be hurt using the shotgun. Because when you restrict certain actions or restrict the player, it hurts the level and the depth of your combat. Now, this will be the point where a few of you may misconstrue this and say, well, just give the player options. 50 different punches, 80 different kicks, 50 grabs, 60 air dash combos. But quantity does not lead to quality in this respect. There has to be a kind of willingness or an interaction between the player and the combat to make this work. So at this point, I want to switch over to footage of an indie game that we played during one of our debut dev showcase. And with this footage, so this is coming from a first-time developer, I want you to keep track of how I'm kind of interacting with the enemy through my attacks, being able to juggle them, being able to hit them. That will come back up in a few more minutes. But you don't need a lot of combat or a lot of moves. You just need these moves to matter. And you need to make it that the player has access to a variety of means of fighting. To go back to the 3D action example, here's another point that I'm sure every one of you watching this has ran into. The classic, every time you knock the enemy down, if you're within 2 feet of them, when they get up, they will always do a counterattack. Because what ends up happening is that when you know repetitive actions in an action game, it lets you play the AI. So we always know that if I'm behind the enemy, they're going to do the same sweep attack or the same backhand. Well, now I'll just dodge back in front and hit that. And we once again repeat that action again and again. Now this is where we get to the shots fired portion of our video. Because one of the aspects that we've seen with kind of the growth of action or branching out action design has been in the mobile and live service space. And every time I see someone on social media talk about the depth of 3D action in mobile games like Genshin, even with Arknight's Enfield, and especially Punishing Gray Raven, I have to bite my tongue a little bit not to respond. Because these games, again, go for quantity, but they don't necessarily go for quality. That every character still has like the same 2 to 3 basic actions, one super fancy cutscene attack. And people will talk about it, and all the time I just see it like this, that the depth is all the fire characters wear red, all the ice characters wear blue, all the poison characters wear purple, because we can't use green, even though green is normally the color related to toxin or toxic, because green is always lightning, or maybe it's wind. And you'll have people on YouTube come up with these massive video meta guides where it's just, okay, put the red character next to the red character next to the red character, and then you throw in the red character. And then be sure to like and subscribe for more meta guide breaking tips for this game. And then in 6 to 8 months, the game will introduce the first dual class character. Because, oh my goodness, this character can be in both a fire team and a poison team? Surely this is the most complicated action game of all time. And meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out cannonball parrying in Ultra Kill or coming up with another crazy combination in a Grim Dawn or Path of Exile. Like I came up with a Necromancer Warrior in Path of Exile, and while it wasn't the most optimized or meta-breaking character, damn, I really love playing that build. And this goes, or in a way, this extends from the conversation that I had, I think, with, what was his name, Craig Stern, when we were talking about RPG design. And he said that for a game to be an RPG, there must be interesting decisions for the player to do. And to piggyback off of that, if you want your action design to pop, the player has to feel like they have a variety of means of interacting with the world and with the enemies, and that they can do any of this at any time. If you design, again, an enemy in a parry-focused game that ignores or is immune to all parrying, and the player has no other way of fighting them, what do you expect them to do? What all the times ends up happening is, you just wait for them to do the same 3-hit combo. Dodge around, hit them 2-3 times in the back. Hit them do the same 2-3 hit combo. Dodge around. And we repeat it again and again. And you'll see this in a lot of AAA and kind of lesser action games where no matter what you give the player, no matter what you throw at them, they're just doing the same actions. Sometimes this is very much forced by the design. If you only have one light attack, one heavy attack, one throw, there's only so many combinations you can make with that. And if you want to see just how much things have evolved in terms of player interaction and making it feel amazing to fight, you can look at this in the evolution of the beat-em-up genre. If you play any beat-em-up game like circa before like 2010s, what will always happen is jump kick the enemy, and then from the time they're in the air until the time they're standing back up, you can't hit them ever again. Then we look at beat-em-ups today following Fight and Rage, where now it turns into do a 3-hit combo to launch the enemy, jump up, hit them 3 or 4 times, slam them to the ground, the bounce back sends them back up so you hit them another 2 to 3 more times, grab them in the air, throw them to hit the other enemy, bouncing them further, jump, do another 2 to 3 hit combo, slam them to the ground, repeat, kick them into a wall, they bounce off the wall, do another 3 to 5 hits, grab them, throw them across the screen, hit another enemy, and we continue to come up about 40 more hits. The enemy died like 50 hits ago, but we don't care, we're just keeping that combo alive. And you'll see this in stuff like Streets of Rage 4, Absalom, and a lot of other titles. And this is what players want to do, like this kind of interaction in the beat-em-up or the action mechanics. It's a very similar feel to that of making use of all the jumps that are possible in a 3D Mario game. We've talked about this before. If you can make the act of just jumping around exciting in a platformer, you're on the right track. And when you play a Mario game, you don't need to make use of all of the 3D tech in order to get through it. Maybe for the optional stuff, but that's besides the point here. But it's still there. It has that higher skill ceiling, that it can tease the player to experiment, reward them for doing it, and for expert players, that's kind of where they start off at. As I've talked about before, that when you play a lot of the early levels in a 3D Mario, the path that you take through it is going to be dependent on your own skill level. The game doesn't stop you and say, oh, you must only use the double jump right here, or you must only do a spin jump, and if you do any other jump, you will never make it. Instead, you can do whatever combination of jumps, dives, flips, side flips, more jumps that you want. And with combat, to go back to Ultra Kill's example, that when you pull off a just multi-weapon swapping combo, it feels really great to do because that's you doing it. This is where we get to, again, why a lot of people feel very polarizing around Doom Eternal. Doom Eternal says, you're going to quick swap between these weapons, hit those weak points, or you're not getting any dessert, or beat the level. And forcing the player to do something versus just letting them figure things out and rewarding them for doing this as their own accord are two very different things. To bring this to the ARPG genre for a moment, It's what we see for games in terms of how meta build reliant they are. If you have 97 skills, and only 3 of those skills are meta worthy, then you only have a 3 build game. And people who want to do anything else will feel like the game is punishing them for it. And I've talked about this feeling in a lot of action design, where I feel like if I kind of try and color outside the lines, maybe instead of just dodging around this enemy, I try to go for a parry, I go for a grab. Maybe I do a dash into a up or a launcher attack. If I do anything that is not what is intended or the structure of this enemy, it doesn't work. And it can feel very frustrating to the player when that happens. I have all these different moves, but the best option, charge heavy, knock the enemy back. Charge heavy, knock the enemy back. Dodge, charge heavy, hit the enemy back. And here's a question for you watching this. As I said, Doom Eternal and Doom Dark Ages are 2 very different games in terms of their action design. Which one did you prefer if you did play them? Did you like the more technical and kind of demanding focus of Doom Eternal, or kind of the smoothing it all down aspect of Doom the Dark Ages? And as a bonus point, or a bonus question, if you did play Doom the Dark Ages and the DLC for the Dark Ages, did you enjoy the changes that were added with the expansion? Because combat design is very nuanced in terms of how it feels. Any new move, any new weapon, any new skill you introduce is a new tool in the player's toolbox. And if that tool can be used for a variety of purposes, they're going to be very excited about it. But to bring this back to, or to take this to Metroidvania design for a second, if all you introduce are just simple keys to locks, you have the red punch, which now allows you to do damage to red enemies, and nothing else. You're just, again, adding number to try and make number more interesting. Which, in a way, that's what kind of happened with DMC, with the whole kind of like angel, devil, red, blue kind of thing. And if you do decide to go down, once again, that path of having very explicit kind of means of fighting enemies, then you need to make that clear in terms of the GUI and the design. If you can only dodge yellow bullets, then you want to make sure the player can see those yellow bullets very easily. If they can only shoot blue enemies, then that needs to be, again, very explicit in your face. Because one of the worst things you can do for games that are very explicit is that all those tells, all that important information the player needs to know, is being drowned out by a multicolored noise of flashes, lights, explosions, heavy metal, more explosions, strobe effects, and lens flare. Lots and lots of lens flare. For those of you watching, as a kind of final question, other than the examples we've talked about here, what are your favorite examples of advanced action design? So this is when we're talking about, again, games like Devil May Cry 3, like Fight and Rage, where you're going to have a lot of means of fighting. You don't have to use them if you don't want to, but they're there for experimentation and to grow. And what is your limit? Where do you feel like if the combat gets to this point in terms of technical and player kind of mastery requirement, is it too much for you to handle? Because that, again, is another important aspect of action design. You can't just keep ratcheting it up. Okay, we start the player with 10 punches. By the end of the game, they have 87 different punches of different lengths, recovery frames, wind up, charge, attack, attack type, enemies that are strong against it, enemies that are weak against it. And we just, try to make the kind of 4x grand strategy version of God Hand. Which, who knows, that could even be a game idea. If anyone decides to make that, you better give me credit for it. For that, we'll be back for more design talks, indie games with more or less punching, kicking, and launching in the future. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the video, do the YouTubing stuff, be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.